"Shut your filthy mouth." The words hit like a gunshot, echoing off marble walls. But Jasmine Crockett didn't so much as flinch. In just 47 seconds, the same Donald J. Trump, who'd commanded crowds of 20,000 and ruled headlines for 40 years, would be facing evidence so explosive it could shake 38 million live viewers to their core. Proof of a secret buried for over 11 years, and a truth powerful enough to strip the most protected man in America down to nothing but silence. The chamber didn't breathe. The red tally light above the cameras glowed solid, a reminder that every blink, every flicker of expression was being broadcast into homes, bars, offices, and nursing centers across the country. Somewhere in Kansas, a retired veteran turned up the volume. In Atlanta, a grandmother paused mid-knitting. In Texas, Maria Alvarez, hidden away under federal protection, leaned forward on her couch. The speaker's gavel struck wood with a sound that rattled through every rib in the room. Bang! 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 It was the call to order, but it felt like a drumbeat to war. The first thing the cameras caught wasn't a speech or an opening statement. It was light. The relentless pop and flash of cameras from over 100 journalists packed shoulder to shoulder, their lenses swinging like predators hunting a single, precise kill shot. Flashes reflected off the glossy wood of the committee table, off the glass water pitchers, off the shine of polished shoes. The air was a haze of anticipation, the faint scent of hairspray mixing with the heat from the stage lights. And through it all, the reporters murmured, small, frantic exchanges, fingers flying over keyboards as they tried to guess what was about to detonate in front of them. The double doors at the back of the chamber opened. She walked in. Jasmine Crockett didn't glance at the press or the rows of lawmakers. She didn't acknowledge the lenses tracking her every move. She stepped through the threshold like she was crossing into enemy territory. Not rushing, not hesitating, just precise, deliberate, as if every second of her entrance was part of a countdown only she knew. In her right hand, she carried a thick manila envelope, edges worn from being opened and closed too many times to count. But it was what she carried in her left that no one expected. Small, concealed. Fingers curled tight around it, almost as if her palm was guarding a pulse. Whatever it was, the cameras couldn't see it, not yet, but its presence was electric, and the journalists who noticed it began whispering furiously into their phones. Donald Trump, seated at the far end of the long oak table, watched her like a man studying a chessboard. His posture was loose, casual, almost bored. But his eyes, those restless, darting eyes, followed the tiny movements of her hands. The smirk he wore earlier had softened, just enough to suggest that somewhere beneath that self-assurance was a flicker of unease. The heavy carpet muffled Jasmine's footsteps, but the sound of her heels still cut through the room like the ticking of a metronome. 1, 2, 3. Each step made the silence denser. By the time she reached her seat, the energy in the chamber had shifted. The side conversations faded. Pens stopped scratching. Even the mechanical whir of the camera rails seemed to slow. She set the envelope on the table without a sound. Then, with the same calm precision, she placed the smaller object directly beside it. Not in front of her, but within arm's reach, close enough to touch, far enough to make the people around her wonder. Trump tilted his head. The overhead lights caught the flash of his cufflinks, the deep red of his tie, an almost theatrical warning flare. He leaned toward his attorney, lips barely moving, and whatever he whispered made the man's jaw tighten. The chairman cleared his throat into the microphone. This hearing will address the misuse of humanitarian aid funds designated for migrant families. The words were bland, bureaucratic, but the temperature in the room told another story. Everyone knew this session was more than budget lines and aid reports. This was a fuse being lit. Jasmine didn't lift her gaze from the table. She let the chairman's voice roll over her, let the official record frame the moment as ordinary, while the truth sat inches from her hands. Somewhere above, a camera swung in, locking a tight shot on her face. She didn't blink. Her left hand brushed the edge of the smaller object. Just a graze, a reminder to herself that it was still there. Her right tapped the envelope once, a slow, deliberate beat that might have been mistaken for nerves. It wasn't. It was a signal. For 3 weeks, she'd carried both items like artifacts, each one capable of detonating in its own way. The envelope held the proof, the smaller item, the story. Behind her, a cluster of aides exchanged looks. One of them mouthed, "Is she really going to do it?" She didn't answer. She didn't even turn. Trump finally broke the stillness. He adjusted his microphone, the scrape of metal on wood sharp in the quiet. "People like her," he began, voice heavy with contempt. "Och will never understand real America." The remark floated over the table like smoke. The Republican side of the chamber chuckled. One man even clapped once, as if the hearing had become a stand-up routine. Jasmine's eyes lifted. Just enough. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She simply looked at him, and in that look was the weight of every word he hadn't heard yet. The evidence that would leave him wishing the cameras had gone dark before the gavel ever fell. The silence between them stretched, taut as wire. Somewhere a pen rolled off a desk and hit the carpet without a sound. And then slowly Jasmine reached forward. Her fingertips rested on the manila envelope, pressing down like it was the lid of something alive. She leaned in, voice soft enough to draw the microphones closer. "Mr. Chairman, before we begin," the room leaned with her. In the back, a young reporter forgot to type. In the front, a veteran correspondent adjusted her glasses, sensing the frame that would lead the evening news. Jasmine's eyes flicked once to the smaller object beside the envelope, then back to the chairman. "I think it's only fair," she continued, "that we start with the truth." No one moved. Trump's smirk was gone. The cameras tightened their focus. Somewhere in millions of living rooms across America, people leaned forward, unknowingly stepping into the moment where politics would end and something far more dangerous would begin. Donald J. Trump leaned back in his chair, the posture of a man who had walked into 100 rooms like this and walked out untouched. The leather creaked under his weight. A slow smile curled at the corner of his mouth. The kind of smile that wasn't just confidence. It was a bet placed on his own invincibility. He turned his head slightly toward his lead attorney, cupping one hand by his mouth. The microphone didn't catch the words, but the reaction told the story. The attorney's lips twisted into a smirk, shoulders shaking once in a private laugh. A junior aide beside them bit back a grin, eyes darting toward Jasmine, as if they'd already declared the match over before the first move was made. From the outside, it looked like a victory pose. From the inside, it was arrogance distilled into body language. An unspoken, "I've got this." Trump's fingers began their tell. 3 taps on the polished wood, each one perfectly spaced, then a pause, then 3 more. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable, something he did when he believed he was in control, a quiet drumbeat of self-assurance. The cameras caught it, a tight zoom on his hand, the gold of his cufflinks catching the light, the subtle rhythm of his index finger striking down. On television, the shot was almost cinematic, a symbol of power at rest, of a man who thought the game was his before it began. He leaned in just enough to be caught on the secondary feed. His eyes weren't on the chairman nor the committee. They were locked on Jasmine Crockett. To him, she was another opponent at another table, one of countless faces he'd brushed aside over decades of litigation, hearings, and public fights. In his mind, she was simply here to play her role, ask questions, make noise, grab headlines, then fade. His smile deepened as she adjusted her microphone. To him, it looked like nerves. To her, it was a blade being unsheathed. The chamber's air was thick, but Trump sat in it like a man lounging by a pool. The faint shuffle of paper from his legal team sounded almost like a card dealer stacking the deck. His deck. He knew the drill. Step 1. Discredit the opponent before they can land a blow. Step 2. Redirect the conversation to safer ground. Step 3. Walk out the same way he walked in. Untouched, unshaken, untouchable. It was a playbook he'd run for years, and in his mind, this day would be no different. The smirk didn't falter, even as the cameras drifted back toward Jasmine. He could see the lens edge past her shoulder and catch him in the background, a man at ease, larger than the moment, waiting for his turn to speak. He liked that shot. Somewhere deep in his mind, he imagined the still frames in tomorrow's headlines. Trump unshaken in heated hearing. He pictured the cable segments, the friendly commentators nodding, repeating his words, reinforcing the image of a man in control. It was theater, and he believed himself the director. Jasmine glanced his way, once briefly, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something he didn't recognize. Not deference, not fear, not even anger. It was calculation. The kind of look you see from someone who isn't just in the fight. They've already decided where the final blow will land. Trump's fingers tapped again, a steady cadence. But this time the sound seemed sharper, louder against the silence. A reporter in the press row caught the rhythm and jotted a note. Tapping, confidence, or nerves. Another journalist raised their camera just a little higher, catching the side angle where Trump's smirk and Jasmine's stillness existed in the same frame. The moment was almost too perfect, a split-screen battle before the battle. He leaned toward his attorney again, murmuring something that made the man grin wider. The attorney's eyes slid toward Jasmine, scanning her posture, her hands, the envelope by her side. Trump chuckled once, low in his throat. The sound didn't carry to the microphone, but in the charged stillness of the room, those close enough to hear felt it. It wasn't just confidence, it was dismissal. The chairman shuffled his notes, clearing his throat for the opening statement, but Trump's gaze never left Jasmine. In his mind, she was already behind. The hearing was a boardroom negotiation to him, one where the other side always blinked first. He leaned back again, arms resting on the chair's edge like a king surveying a loyal court. The tapping resumed. His eyes slid briefly to the press cameras, and for a fraction of a second, he adjusted his tie, angling his chin toward the lens. It was the old showman's instinct. Never miss your angle. The screen feed to millions of Americans caught the image. The confident tilt of the head, the composed hands, the small laugh like an inside joke between him and the world watching. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't take the bait. Instead, she adjusted the small, hidden object beside her envelope. So slight a motion that most would miss it. But the few who noticed felt a current shift. The kind of shift that says, the one who smiles now might not smile last. In living rooms across America, some viewers leaned closer without even realizing it. The framing was perfect. Trump's self-satisfied smirk on one side of the table, Jasmine's still, coiled focus on the other. It was a standoff wrapped in politeness, the calm before a courtroom storm. The camera lingered on Trump for another 3 seconds before cutting back to the wide shot. His hand was still tapping, and somewhere deep beneath the surface of his rehearsed calm, the first hairline crack began to form. Because in 47 seconds, the boardroom game he thought he was playing would turn into something else entirely, something he couldn't walk out of untouched. Not this time. Jasmine Crockett didn't lunge for the kill. She didn't rush to unsheath her sharpest blade. Instead, she let the silence breathe. The chairman finished his procedural introduction, his voice flat and formal, reciting the committee's stated purpose. But in the undercurrent of that monotone, the room pulsed with the knowledge that something heavier was coming. When the microphone clicked live in front of her, Jasmine didn't pounce on Donald Trump's insult. She didn't take the bait that would turn the morning into another back-and-forth shouting match for the cameras. She went somewhere else entirely. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her tone measured, almost courteous. "Before we move forward with my questions, I'd like to address a matter of public concern." A small ripple moved through the audience seating behind her. "I'm referring," she continued, "to the $6.7 million in humanitarian aid funds that never reached the migrant shelters it was designated for." The number hung in the air like a suspended gavel. Somewhere in the second row, a journalist's pen stopped mid-stroke. Another typed the number into their tablet, their fingers pausing before adding the words "missing aid funds." Trump's smirk didn't falter, but his tapping hand slowed, fractionally. Jasmine didn't look at him. She reached for the manila envelope, her movements deliberate, as if each second she took to touch it added to its gravity. She slid it across the table until it rested neatly beside her microphone. Not opened, not even tilted toward her, just placed, like a loaded weapon set on the table in plain sight. The cameras caught it instantly. The tight shot framed the envelope perfectly in the foreground, Jasmine in crisp focus behind it, her expression unreadable. On the other side of the screen, millions of viewers adjusted in their chairs, instinctively drawn toward the mystery they couldn't yet see. She rested her fingertips lightly on the envelope, not gripping, not tearing into it, just holding it the way you might hold the railing at the edge of a cliff. Her eyes finally lifted to meet the chairman's. "I'll be brief," she said, her voice carrying that deceptive calm that always precedes a courtroom verdict. "What I'm about to present will make some people wish these cameras weren't rolling today." A soft gasp rippled through the back rows, more felt than heard. Trump's eyes narrowed. His posture shifted forward by an inch, so slight that only those watching him closely would notice. The hand that had been tapping was now still, resting flat against the polished wood. The chairman hesitated, glancing between the two of them. "Representative Crockett, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," she cut in, her tone still civil, but with an edge like the first crack of ice before it breaks, "that truth doesn't always fit neatly into the agenda we set before a hearing begins." She tapped the envelope once, the sound a sharp pop in the microphone. It was enough to make every camera in the room shift, zoom, refocus. On the feed, the tap was amplified, echoing into living rooms like a single knock at the door you've been dreading to open. Trump leaned back again, forcing his smirk to return. But it didn't land the same way now. There was something tighter about it, like the smile of a man who's starting to wonder if the joke is still his to tell. Jasmine let the pause stretch. She didn't fill it with more words. She let the tension do the work for her, knowing the mind fills silence with its own worst possibilities. And in that quiet, she shifted her hand away from the envelope, just enough to make it seem less like a threat and more like a promise. Her gaze swept the room not hurriedly, but as if she were taking attendance. Not of people, but of attention. She found the cameras, the press row, the faces of her colleagues, and finally let her eyes settle on Trump. For a heartbeat, neither of them blinked. "This committee is here to investigate the disappearance of $6.7 million in aid," she said. "I am here to show you what else disappeared, and who made it disappear." A single murmur ran through the chamber, like wind catching the edge of a tent. Trump's attorney leaned toward him, whispering quickly, but Trump kept his eyes on Jasmine, the faintest clench at his jaw. The audience behind the rope lines leaned forward in unison. The journalists were ready to type, their fingers poised but waiting, because this wasn't the kind of statement you summarize halfway through. Jasmine lowered her eyes to the envelope once more, sliding it an inch closer to her microphone, as though proximity to the mic would make its contents louder when the time came. "This," she said softly, "is not just about numbers on a ledger." Another pause. "This is about something human, something that cannot be written off as a clerical error or a budget oversight." The phrasing was careful, intentional, the kind that made people on the outside think she's building to something. And she was. She placed both hands flat on the table now, framing the envelope between them, claiming it the way a lawyer claims their strongest piece of evidence in open court. "I'll give everyone here one last moment to take in the room as it is right now," she said, "because in a few minutes, it will not be the same." No one moved. Not the press, not the committee, not Trump. In the far corner, a sound tech glanced up from his monitor, drawn in by the weight of her tone. Somewhere beyond the chamber doors in homes across America, people watching live shifted forward in their seats. The number, $6.7 million, still hung in the air, but now it was tethered to something else, something unseen. And Jasmine Crockett, without raising her voice, without even opening the envelope, had already made the room hers. But the weight of that envelope wasn't born in this chamber. It began 3 weeks earlier, in a place no camera could find. San Antonio. A small church pressed into the side of a quiet street, its paint faded by decades of sun. Below it, down a narrow set of stone steps, was a basement that smelled faintly of candle wax and incense. The kind of place where secrets found shelter and the air carried the low hum of whispered prayers. A single bulb swung above a wooden table. The light pooled in a soft gold circle, just enough to reveal the face of the woman sitting across from Jasmine. Maria Alvarez. Her hands trembled against the worn tabletop, fingers twisting the edge of a manila envelope until its corners bent. The scent of incense clung to her clothes. Her eyes were rimmed in red, not from a single night's crying, but from years of holding tears back. He told me to disappear, she said, her voice breaking halfway through the sentence. It was not a dramatic confession. It was quieter than that, the kind of statement that didn't need volume to be heavy. Jasmine didn't speak. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, her own hands open. Not to take, not yet, but to show she was ready to receive whatever Maria was carrying. Maria slid the envelope forward. The faint scrape of paper against wood was the loudest sound in the room. Jasmine hesitated for half a second, then pulled it toward her. The paper was warm from Maria's touch, the seal brittle, worn from being opened and resealed too many times to count. When she lifted the flap, the air in the room seemed to shift. Inside, neatly stacked, were 3 documents and a single photograph. On top, the DNA test. Not a copy. Not a blurred fax. The original, notarized and signed in blue ink. Her eyes scanned the header, the sterile lines of a lab report. 2 subjects. Blood samples matched against each other. And there it was near the bottom, in bold type. Paternity probability, 99.98%. Above it, the names. Subject A, Donald John Trump. Subject B, Lucia Maria Alvarez. Jasmine's gaze stayed on those names for a long moment. The letters seemed to weigh more than the paper could hold. Maria's voice cracked again. She was 11 the last time I let myself hope. Jasmine glanced up, catching the way Maria's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. He said if I ever spoke, I'd lose more than my job. I'd lose her. So I hid. I told her nothing. The photograph slipped from the stack and landed on the table. It was black and white, grainy, time-stamped in the corner. A younger Maria in a hospital gown, her hair damp against her face. In her arms, a newborn wrapped in a blanket. Jasmine reached out, brushing her fingertips against the photo without lifting it. She could feel Maria's eyes on her, searching for something. Judgment, disbelief, maybe a crack of compassion. All Jasmine gave her was stillness. In that stillness, Maria's words came softer, almost a whisper. I'm invisible to him, but she looks just like him. Jasmine closed the envelope slowly, pressing the flap flat with her palm. She didn't promise victory. She didn't offer comfort she couldn't guarantee. She said only one thing, steady and low. I'll make them see her. For a moment, the only sound was the bulb's faint hum above them. Maria exhaled, a breath that seemed to take years to release. She slid her chair back, but not before her hand brushed Jasmine's in something like gratitude, something like surrender. Jasmine left the church basement with the envelope clutched under her arm. Outside, the Texas sun felt harsher, the noise of the street too loud after the sanctuary's quiet. She didn't look back. For the next 3 weeks, she carried that envelope everywhere, tucked inside a folder, locked in a briefcase, resting on her nightstand while she slept. She read the documents over and over until the numbers and names burned into her memory. It was no longer paper. It was evidence. It was a countdown. And now here in the Capitol, that same envelope sat beside her microphone, exactly where she'd placed it. Trump didn't know where it had been. He didn't know about the church basement or the smell of incense, or the way Maria's voice shook on the words, he told me to disappear. He only saw a piece of paper. But Jasmine knew what it carried. She knew the gold pool of light in that basement, the weight of a mother's fear, the way the bold print on a lab report could crush or free a life. Her fingertips grazed the envelope now, the same way they had in that basement. And though she hadn't opened it yet, though the cameras were still waiting, the room was already different. Because she knew what came next, and she knew he wasn't ready for it. The gavel had barely settled from the last strike when Donald Trump leaned into his microphone. His voice was smooth, almost lazy, but every word carried the unmistakable sting of calculated mockery. People like her, he began, drawing out the pause just long enough to make sure every ear in the chamber turned toward him, don't understand family values. The phrase landed in the air like a challenge dressed as a moral statement. It was the kind of jab designed not just to insult, but to diminish, to frame her as an outsider to an ideal he claimed as his own. From the Republican side of the room, low laughter bubbled up and swelled into something louder. A few aides smirked. One congressman actually clapped once, as though Trump had delivered a punchline instead of an accusation. The sound spread like wildfire, bouncing off the marble walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. But Jasmine didn't blink. Her right hand rested on the table, still and steady. Her left lifted just slightly, enough for her fingertips to graze the top edge of the manila envelope. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was small, almost casual, like a pianist touching the keys before the first note. Her eyes never left him. Trump leaned back, soaking in the ripple of approval from his side of the chamber. He looked around as though to savor the moment, his gaze sweeping the press row before returning to her. His smirk widened, a silent dare. "Come on, hit me back." She didn't. Instead, she let the laughter play out, let it echo and thin until it began to die under its own weight. Silence, she knew, could strangle arrogance faster than shouting ever could. And in that silence, she kept her gaze fixed on him, unblinking. It was the kind of stare that could strip away the walls a person hides behind. The kind that says, "I know what you've built, and I know where the cracks are." The cameras found her face and held it in a tight shot. She looked neither angry nor amused, but something in between. Poised, controlled, the calm before an impact no one else could see coming. Trump's hand, the same one that had been tapping moments earlier, now stilled. His fingers curled slightly against the tabletop. Jasmine's thumb drifted along the envelope's flap. She didn't open it, didn't even break the seal. But the movement was enough to draw eyes back to it, as if the paper itself had begun to hum with possibility. From somewhere behind her, a pen scratched against paper. A reporter was writing a single word in the margin of their notes, foreshadowing. Trump tried to reclaim the moment, leaning forward again. "You see," he said, gesturing toward her with an open palm, "this is what's wrong with the people running these hearings. They come in here with their ideas about family." Jasmine's fingers stopped moving. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply let him speak, filling the air with his own voice, giving him rope he didn't yet realize he was holding. When he paused for breath, the room seemed to tilt toward her. Everyone, even those who'd been laughing, could feel the tension building like a low note under a song. She exhaled once, slowly, and her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that some in the back had to lean forward to hear. "Family values," she said, her tone almost conversational, "are worth defending, especially for those who've been denied them." No one laughed now. She didn't elaborate. She didn't give him or his allies a direct target to shoot at. She simply let the words hang there, just vague enough to keep them guessing, just sharp enough to make him shift in his seat. Her eyes stayed locked on his, not moving to her notes, not scanning the committee. She had him pinned, and he knew it. Somewhere in the press section, a camera operator zoomed in on her hand, still resting on the envelope, her thumb brushing the corner in the smallest, most deliberate motion. It wasn't a threat. Not yet. It was a promise. Trump broke eye contact first, glancing toward his attorney. It was brief, but the cameras caught it, and in that fleeting moment, the balance in the room shifted. Jasmine leaned back, her hand leaving the envelope as if to say, "We'll get there." The laughter that had filled the chamber minutes earlier was gone now, replaced by a silence so complete that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder. She reached for a glass of water, lifted it slowly, took a measured sip. Every second she delayed felt like a tightening screw in the room's collective chest. When she set the glass down, she spoke again, her voice still calm. "We can debate values all day, Mr. President, but today," she tapped the envelope once. Just once. But the microphone caught it like a heartbeat. "Today is about facts." The tap was soft, but it reverberated like a starting gun. Trump shifted in his chair. His smirk didn't return this time. The envelope sat between them, silent and unassuming, but now it had its own gravity, pulling every gaze toward it. The laughter was gone. The room was hers again, and she hadn't even opened it. Not yet. With the slow precision of someone moving a relic, Jasmine reached beneath her notes and drew out something thinner, flatter. She slid it forward until it lay directly beside the envelope. A photograph, black and white, face down. The edges were softened with time, the corners slightly curled. It looked harmless enough, ordinary even, but the way her hand lingered on it told a different story. The cameras caught the movement immediately. Lenses zoomed, adjusting focus to the rectangle of paper now sitting between her and Donald Trump. On the broadcast feed, the contrast between the dark wood of the desk and the pale back of the photo was stark, almost theatrical. Across the table, Trump's eyes flickered toward it, just for a moment, quick enough that most would miss it, but the press didn't. Two reporters in the front row scribbled at the same time. Photo? Jasmine didn't explain it. She didn't touch it again. She simply let it sit there, face down, like a secret too heavy to reveal, without the right silence. The room felt that silence now. It was the kind that didn't just settle, it spread. A congressman on the far right side of the dais leaned in, squinting, as though his eyes alone could will the image to flip over. Another, a woman seated 3 chairs from the chairman, tilted her head just enough to catch a sliver of the photograph's surface. The camera panned to their faces, curiosity etched into their brows, the faint tension in their jaws betraying more than they wanted the public to see. On the feed, the moment was subtle but powerful. Elected officials, some of them Trump's allies, straining ever so slightly towards something Jasmine had not yet given them permission to see. And still, she said nothing. She let the weight of the unknown press down on them, on him, on the millions watching. Every second she waited was a turn of the screw, the kind that tightens the chest without anyone realizing they've stopped breathing. Trump shifted in his seat, trying to recapture his earlier swagger. His hand moved to straighten his tie, his jaw set in that familiar mask of impatience. But his gaze, unwillingly perhaps, kept returning to the photograph. Jasmine noticed. She didn't look directly at him. She didn't need to. The corner of her mouth tilted in the smallest acknowledgement. Not a smile, more like an understanding. Then she leaned back in her chair, hands folded loosely in front of her, the photo still between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but carried with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "This is not evidence in the traditional sense," she said, pausing just long enough for the phrase to settle. "It's a reminder." A murmur rippled through the gallery seating. In the back row, a young aide whispered to another, earning a sharp glance from security. The chairman leaned forward. "Representative Crockett, are you prepared to—" "In time," Jasmine cut in gently, her tone respectful but final. The photograph remained face down. The envelope remained sealed. Yet both objects seemed to radiate more force than the testimony of 100 witnesses. The cameras switched angles, catching the expressions of committee members, one by one. Some looked impatient, others wary, but a few wore something closer to unease. The kind of unease that comes when you suspect you're about to learn something you'd rather not. Jasmine tapped the back of the photograph once with her index finger. Light, almost absent-minded, but deliberate enough to draw the eye. The sound was faint in the chamber, but through the microphones it came through the broadcast as a crisp click, like the shutter of a camera. Viewers at home didn't know what the image showed, but they felt the tension in the room shift. The focus was no longer on the verbal sparring. It was on whatever was trapped in that captured moment, hidden in plain sight. Trump's attorney leaned in close to whisper something in his ear. Trump didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the photo, his brow tightening in a way that hadn't been there minutes ago. Jasmine saw it, and she let it breathe. "Sometimes," she said, finally lifting her gaze to meet his across the table, "the things we try hardest to bury are the very things that rise to the surface when the light finds them." No one moved. The photo stayed face down. The envelope stayed sealed. But the power had already shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just in the room, it was in the air. The cameras, the millions of silent viewers leaning closer without even realizing it. Trump's fingers began that familiar tap against the table once more. But this time, the rhythm was uneven. The pressure was beginning to turn. And then, it happened. A sound, soft at first, slipped into the chamber, so unexpected that even the most jaded reporters froze mid-note. It wasn't the scrape of a chair or the shuffle of papers. It was a voice, high, small, unmistakably young. "I think my daddy is on TV." The words floated from the overhead speakers, fragile yet clear, like glass wind chimes in a dead-still room. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Heads turned, not toward Jasmine, not toward Trump, but toward the invisible source of that voice. The gallery went utterly still. The sound carried the unfiltered cadence of childhood, hesitant but brave, like someone speaking into a world they couldn't see but felt was listening. On the feed, camera operators instinctively cut to wide shots. The entire room was caught in that moment. Lawmakers stiff-backed in their chairs, reporters lowering pens, staffers leaning forward with expressions they hadn't planned to show. Jasmine didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her gaze resting on the envelope, as if she had nothing to do with the voice that was now wrapping itself around every heart in the room. The voice came again, a little steadier this time. "I hope he remembers me." Somewhere to Jasmine's right, a congresswoman's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. A man across the aisle swallowed hard, his Adam's apple shifting against his tie. In the third row of the gallery, a woman clutched her purse a little tighter, her eyes glassy. Trump's reaction was the only movement in the room that felt deliberate. His brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in recognition. The tapping stopped. His hand gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly that the leather groaned under the strain. The muscles in his jaw jumped. His lips pressed into a flat, colorless line. Jasmine still hadn't looked at him. The voice continued, softer now, almost like a confession whispered into a diary. "Mama says I look just like him." A subtle, collective inhale swept through the chamber. No one wanted to break it, but they couldn't help reacting. Even the camera crews, trained to move with machine-like discipline, hesitated to switch angles, as though afraid the movement might fracture the moment. On screen, the shot lingered on the manila envelope, the face-down photograph, and Jasmine's calm, steady posture. The voice of the child became the soundtrack, filling in the spaces her silence left open. A tear slid down the cheek of a staffer standing against the wall, quickly wiped away but not before a photographer caught it. Trump's grip tightened. His knuckles whitened, the veins along the back of his hand rising like fault lines under strain. Jasmine's eyes finally lifted, not to meet his, but to sweep the room. She didn't rush. Her gaze moved like a tide, touching each corner, making sure the weight of the moment wasn't lost on a single person. She didn't need to say, "This is Lucia." The voice had already named itself in the only way that mattered. The little girl's words hung there, untouched by adult commentary, raw enough to burn through the practiced armor of political theater. Somewhere deep in the chamber, a man coughed to disguise the sound of his own breathing. Trump's attorney leaned toward him, murmuring something sharp and urgent, but Trump didn't respond. His eyes had gone cold, fixed on some point on the table, not seeing it, not really. The child's voice spoke again, almost shy now. "I don't know if he can hear me, but I hope he can." It was the last line before the recording faded. The final word, "can," lingered in the room, like the tail end of a prayer. Silence followed. Not the tense silence of politics, but the deep human silence that comes after you've heard something you can't unhear. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jasmine leaned forward just slightly, her hands framing the envelope and the photograph as though she were setting the boundaries of a battlefield. She still didn't look at Trump, but she didn't have to. Every camera caught the change in him, the subtle drop of his shoulders, the way his jaw worked as if chewing words he couldn't say out loud. Somewhere in the press section, a reporter scribbled one word in the margin of their notebook: cracked. Jasmine's gaze lowered to the photograph again, her thumb brushing the back just once. Not enough to turn it over. Not yet. The air in the room was heavy now, not with accusation, but with empathy sharpened into a blade. The lawmakers who had laughed minutes earlier avoided each other's eyes. Trump shifted, releasing the armrest, flexing his fingers once before setting them flat on the table. The camera zoomed, the frame tight on his hands as if the nation could read guilt or defiance in the tendons of his grip. Jasmine's voice finally entered the space the child's had left behind. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the truth doesn't come from us. It comes from the ones who had to live with our choices." She let that settle. And then, still calm, still unshaken, she added, "And they don't forget." Her right hand slid deliberately toward the small cloth bundle tucked under her folder. For a heartbeat, the room didn't register what she was holding, just a frayed loop of fabric, limp and faded from years of wear. But as she lifted it higher, turning it so the overhead light struck the letters, recognition rippled through the chamber like a shockwave. The words were unmistakable. Trump 2020. America First. It wasn't pristine like the campaign merchandise once sold in stadium parking lots. This one was torn at the seam. Its color bled into a dull, almost gray tone. One edge was stiffened with what everyone knew, even without being told, was dried blood. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The bracelet did the speaking. "This," she began, her tone so measured it carried more weight than a shout ever could, "was found around the wrist of an 11-year-old girl in a detention facility in McAllen, Texas." Her eyes scanned the room. No one moved. She had been there for 2 days. No medical chart, no insulin for her type 1 diabetes. She was running a fever of 103. The cut on her arm from a rusted fence post had gone untreated, bandaged only by this. She lifted the bracelet an inch higher, letting the cameras drink in every threadbare fiber, every stain. In the gallery, a woman covered her mouth with her hand. One of the younger aides in the corner shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the carpet. She told the intake officer her name was Lucia. Jasmine's voice softened on the name, but the softness made it sharper somehow, cutting deeper. She told them her father's name too. "And you know what they did?" She let the pause stretch, the bracelet still dangling in the light like a relic pulled from the wreckage of something unforgivable. "They replaced her broken ID tag with this," she said, "a campaign slogan." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jasmine stepped forward slightly, holding the bracelet out over the table between her and Trump. "She bled through it by the second night," she continued. "Asked for help, asked for medicine. They gave her a bottle of water and told her to sleep." A murmur of disbelief stirred in the gallery but died quickly. It wasn't the kind of room where people wanted to hear themselves speak. Trump's jaw was locked, his gaze fixed on the bracelet like it was a snake coiled in front of him. Jasmine placed it gently on the table beside the envelope and the face-down photograph. The 3 objects sat in a neat line now: paper, image, fabric, each one telling a part of the story in a different language. "The people who gave her this bracelet," she said, "work for the government of the United States, and the man whose name is printed on it," she let her eyes rest on him for the first time in minutes, "was campaigning for re-election while his daughter lay in a concrete cell." No one laughed now. Even those who had chuckled earlier were motionless, their hands clasped, their faces pale under the bright lights. The bracelet lay still, but it seemed to fill the space between them, a silent accusation more damning than anything she could have said. "This isn't about party," Jasmine continued. "It isn't about left or right. It's about what we're willing to let happen to a child and what we're willing to ignore when that child is ours." The words landed like a slow drumbeat, each one heavier than the last. In the press section, a photographer leaned over to another and whispered, "That's the shot." The other nodded without taking his eye from the viewfinder, his lens locked on the line of objects in front of Jasmine. Trump shifted in his seat, finally breaking his stillness. His hand twitched toward the microphone, but stopped halfway, curling back into a fist against the wood of the table. The cameras didn't miss it. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. "We can debate policies all day," she said, "but policies didn't wrap this around her wrist. People did, and people made the choice to look away." She let her hand hover over the bracelet for a moment before pulling it back, as if touching it any longer might burn. The room felt heavier now, as though the oxygen itself carried the weight of what had just been laid bare. No one smiled, no one dared, and somewhere in living rooms across America, viewers leaned closer to their screens, not because they wanted to see more, but because they knew they were already seeing too much to ever forget. Then came the sound of a latch turning. From the side door of the chamber, one not often used during public hearings, a uniformed officer stepped in first, scanning the room. Behind him, a woman emerged, walking with the steady grace of someone unafraid to be seen, yet carrying the weight of what she was about to do. She was small-framed, her silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. The lines on her face weren't just from age, but from years of holding back stories that pressed against her chest like a physical burden. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather bag. The chairman's voice cut through the murmurs. The committee will now hear testimony from Clara Esteban, retired nurse, formerly of Palmetto Care Clinic, Palm Beach, Florida. The moment the name was spoken, several heads turned sharply, reporters flipping through mental Rolodexes, staffers exchanging quick glances. It wasn't a name they'd seen in the witness schedule. This was unexpected. Clara stepped to the microphone. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "My name is Clara Esteban," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone nurses acquire after years of speaking both to frightened patients and to doctors who don't have time to listen. "I worked at Palmetto Care Clinic for 29 years. I have delivered more than 1,300 babies in my career, and there is one birth I have not spoken about until today." The gallery stilled. The press leaned forward. Her eyes flickered once toward Trump, then back to the committee. It was the night of February 11th, 2012. The mother was Maria Alvarez. She arrived alone. She was scared. She kept asking if the father was coming. "I told her I didn't know." Jasmine didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on Clara, but her hand rested lightly on the envelope, as though guarding it. Clara continued. "The baby was born just after 9 p.m. Healthy, small but strong. The mother cried when she held her, then cried harder when she realized there was no one there to share it with her. She swallowed, and for a moment her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the memory itself." About 30 minutes later, a man came in through the back corridor. No security detail, no announcement, just a heavy coat, a baseball cap pulled low. She paused, the words hanging like a pendulum about to drop. When he stepped into the nursery light, I recognized him instantly. Donald J. Trump. The reaction was immediate, a rustle of disbelief from one side of the room, a wave of murmured, "Oh my God," from the gallery. The cameras swung to catch Trump's face, jaw set, lips pressed together, eyes narrowing into slits. Clara didn't stop. He didn't speak much. He walked straight to the crib. He looked down at the baby, at Lucia, and he picked her up, held her for maybe 20 seconds. Then he put her back and placed a small gift bag next to the crib. She reached into her leather bag and pulled out something wrapped carefully in tissue paper. As she unwrapped it, the camera zoomed in. A tiny plush elephant, slightly faded, but clearly once white. Tucked beside it, a small cream-colored card, the kind you'd slip into a bouquet. Clara held it up. "This was in the bag. I kept it." Jasmine's eyes flickered for the first time, just briefly, as if she too hadn't been certain this moment would come. Clara cleared her throat, then read aloud from the card. "For my little Lucia, D." A visible shiver moved through the gallery. The plush elephant looked pitiful under the harsh committee lights, but it carried the weight of something undeniable. Contact, acknowledgement, presence. Clara's gaze moved back to Trump. "Before he left, I asked if I should write his name on the birth certificate. He shook his head. Told me, and I quote, 'Don't bother, this never happened.'" The room erupted, not in noise, but in the sharp intake of breath that feels like sound without volume. Trump leaned toward his attorney, whispering rapidly. The attorney's face remained neutral, but his pen moved furiously across a legal pad. Clara didn't flinch. "I didn't say anything for years. I was afraid of what it could mean for my job, my safety. But I kept this elephant and this card because I knew one day someone would ask the right question." She set both items gently on the table in front of Jasmine, aligning them with the envelope and the bracelet. 4 objects now, 4 points in a constellation of truth. In the press section, a seasoned political correspondent whispered to the junior beside him, "That's it. That's the crack." Because for Trump's staunchest supporters, denial had always been easy when it came to paper. Reports could be forged, dates could be debated, witnesses could be discredited. But a nurse, a delivery room, a man holding a newborn in the quiet of night, leaving behind a gift and a note in his own handwriting? That wasn't politics. That was human. And it was happening under oath. Trump sat back, jaw locked, eyes fixed on some point beyond the far wall. Jasmine, for her part, simply nodded once to Clara in thanks. No theatrics, no gloating. She knew the damage had been done. The air in the room had changed again, heavier now, tilting against him. Even his allies on the committee avoided looking directly at the plush elephant, as though its very presence was inconvenient truth made tangible. And in millions of homes across the country, people who had once defended him without question found themselves pausing. Jasmine let that silence linger, let it seep into the corners of the room like smoke curling under a door. Then, without warning, she reached for a small black device beside her notes. A single press of her thumb, and the chamber filled with the sharp click of a tape beginning to roll. Static crackled, and then a voice, male, polished, and far too familiar to anyone who'd followed politics in the last decade. "Maria, this can go away. You'll get $130,000. All we need is your signature on the non-disclosure agreement." The cadence was calm, professional, but underneath was the unmistakable hum of urgency, like a man trying to carry a secret across a collapsing bridge. Reporters' heads snapped up. Several of them froze for half a beat, pens hanging in midair before suddenly scratching furiously against paper. From Trump's side of the room came a faint, disjointed murmur. One committee member leaned toward another, whispering something sharp. The aide behind them pretended to shuffle papers, but was clearly trying to listen. The recording continued. "We're offering this in good faith, for everyone's benefit. No press, no legal mess. You walk away with the money, and the story ends here. That's the smart choice." There was a pause on the tape, a faint sound. Maria's voice, small, resolute. "And if I say no?" The answer came without hesitation. "Then you'll regret it." A ripple of unease moved across the chamber like a low current. Trump shifted, his hand moving to cover the microphone in front of him as he leaned toward his attorney. The attorney's jaw worked furiously, words spilling in low tones. Trump didn't look at Jasmine. The recording clicked off. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint hum of the lights overhead. Then the room broke into its own kind of chaos. Not loud, not frantic, but tense. Staffers scribbling notes at double speed. Committee members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. In the press row, a veteran political journalist muttered, "That's a felony if they can prove the timeline," before grabbing her phone and firing off a message to her editor. The murmurs grew just enough to be caught on camera, soft, urgent exchanges layered over the frozen expression on Trump's face. And beyond the marble walls in the digital ether, the wildfire had already started. On Twitter, hashtags like Watch Lucia and the 130K tape were climbing at impossible speed. Cable news producers were already drafting lower thirds. Breaking alleged Trump lawyer tape surfaces in congressional hearing. Inside the chamber, Jasmine remained exactly as she was, hands folded, gaze steady, letting the evidence breathe. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. This wasn't about her winning a point. It was about the point that had just been driven like a spike through the heart of denial. She finally spoke, her tone almost quiet enough to make people lean forward to catch it. "Payments in exchange for silence are not family values, Mr. President. They're just silence." The weight of her words seemed to press down on the entire table. A committee member from Trump's own party cleared his throat, glanced at him, then immediately looked away, pretending to adjust his notes. Another shifted in his chair, the leather squeaking in a way that sounded far too loud in the tight air of the room. Jasmine reached over to the recorder again, not to play more, but to stop it completely, the small click sounding final, decisive. She placed the device on the table, right next to the envelope, the face-down photograph, the frayed campaign bracelet, and the tiny plush elephant. 4 silent witnesses to the truth. And now, the 5th, the voice on the tape. The arrangement was deliberate, almost ritualistic. It wasn't just evidence, it was an altar. Trump sat back, eyes fixed on a point beyond her shoulder. His fingers flexed once, then stilled. Somewhere in the gallery, someone let out a slow, audible exhale. It was the sound of a room realizing there was no neat path back to business as usual. Because this wasn't a headline waiting to be spun. It was a record. It was his lawyer's voice. It was the offer, the amount, the threat, all in his own camp's words. And in millions of homes, phones buzzed on coffee tables. Messages flew. Screenshots spread. People who had defended him in Facebook comment threads now stared at their screens in quiet, uncomfortable stillness. Jasmine didn't move the tape recorder again. She didn't need to. It would be playing over and over outside these walls before the hearing even adjourned. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The air had weight now, thick with anticipation, with the knowledge that something irreversible was coming. Jasmine reached for the envelope. Her fingers brushed the seal, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate, the way a surgeon might touch the first incision. She slid a nail under the flap, the faint tear of paper slicing through the silence like a blade through canvas. Every eye followed the motion. Even the cameras, which had spent the last hour dancing between faces and objects, held steady now. She drew the contents out slowly. Just one document, thick paper, creased from years of careful storage. The watermark caught the light. It was unmistakable, an official birth certificate. Jasmine held it in both hands, letting the embossed seal glint under the overhead lamps before she spoke. "This," she said evenly, "is the state-issued birth certificate of a girl named Lucia Alvarez, issued February 13th, 2012, Miami-Dade County, Florida." She paused just long enough for the words to settle in the minds of the millions watching. Her eyes skimmed the page once more. Then she began to read aloud, her voice calm but unyielding. Child's full name, Lucia Maria Alvarez. Mother's name, Maria Alvarez. Father's name. The pause before the final line wasn't hesitation, it was precision. Donald John Trump. The words landed like a detonation. A sharp intake of breath swept through the chamber, a sound that seemed to suck the air from the marble walls. In the gallery, someone's pen clattered to the floor and rolled under a chair, unclaimed. The cameras swung instantly to Trump. He wasn't smiling anymore. The flush that had colored his cheeks during earlier exchanges had drained away, leaving his skin pale, almost ashen. His gaze had dropped to the table in front of him, but not to the document, his eyes fixed on a single point in the wood grain, unblinking. His right hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles bleaching white under the strain. The left hand, resting in his lap, twitched once, the tremor small but caught in merciless high definition by the cameras overhead. Jasmine didn't fill the silence. She let it live, let it breathe, let it coil itself around the neck of the moment. She placed the birth certificate flat on the table, aligning it with the bracelet, the plush elephant, the face-down photograph, and the recorder. A perfect line of evidence, each piece now anchored by the document that tied them all together. Trump's attorney leaned in, whispering something sharp, urgent. But Trump didn't look at him. He kept his gaze down, the muscle in his jaw working furiously, as if each word being whispered was a stone he couldn't swallow. The chairman cleared his throat, but even he didn't speak. In the press section, the energy shifted from tense observation to barely contained frenzy. Fingers flew over keyboards, phones lit up with rapid-fire texts to newsrooms. One reporter mouthed the words, "It's over," to another, who only nodded. Jasmine's tone never wavered. "This document," she continued, "was verified yesterday by the Miami-Dade County Registrar's Office. It is authentic, and it bears the name of the man sitting in this chamber today." Trump's eyes flickered, just once, toward the paper. The movement was almost imperceptible, but the cameras caught it. Jasmine noticed. She didn't exploit it with a smile or a jab. She simply added, "The truth is not partisan. It is printed in ink." Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the certificate, as if weighing whether to slide it closer to him. She didn't. Instead, she withdrew her hand entirely, leaving it in the neutral territory between them. The stillness that followed was a different kind of silence, less anticipation, more the stunned quiet of a crowd that has just watched a stone tower collapse in slow motion. Even those in the gallery who had come wearing red ties and campaign pins were motionless now, their eyes flicking between Trump's pale face and the paper that bore his name in black letters. Outside in the living rooms of America, there would be no rewinding this moment into something else, no out-of-context defense. The image of that birth certificate on the table, next to those other artifacts, would be replayed and screenshotted before the hour was over. Trump finally moved, not to speak, not to reach for the document, but to adjust his tie with a hand that betrayed the faintest tremor. Jasmine saw it. So did the cameras. So did the country. And she knew the denial had just been killed in full view of the world. But she wasn't finished. Slowly, she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. Not for another document, not for some cold, bureaucratic artifact, but for something folded, creased, softened by small hands. She laid it gently on the table and began to unfold it, revealing bright smears of crayon on paper gone wrinkled at the edges. It was a child's drawing. The lines were uneven, the colors spilling outside them with that unself-conscious freedom only children possess. In the middle stood two stick figures, one taller, one smaller, their hands joined beneath a huge yellow sun. The sky above them was a wash of impossible blue, the kind you can only find in a crayon box. The taller figure's hair was colored orange. The smaller one had a round face and a pink dress. Beneath the picture, in blocky, uneven letters, was a message written in shaky English. "I'm not hiding anymore." The words didn't just sit on the page. They bled into the space between everyone in the room. Jasmine didn't touch the paper again. She let it sit there, its colors vivid against the stark wood, while she lifted her head and looked straight into the camera lens. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, but with a gravity that made the microphones hum. "The truth doesn't choose side," she said. "It only chooses the people brave enough to speak it." The room didn't move. Not a pen scratched. Not a chair squeaked. Somewhere, a television producer in a control booth mouthed the words, "Hold the shot," and the image of Jasmine, framed by the bracelet, the elephant, the photograph, the tape recorder, the birth certificate, and now this fragile drawing, filled every screen in America. Trump sat motionless, but there was no mistaking the shift. The man who had commanded rallies of 20,000, who had shaped news cycles for 4 decades, now seemed smaller under the weight of a child's crayon son. Jasmine lowered her gaze back to the drawing, not to study it, but as if acknowledging its owner, acknowledging the little girl who had, without ever stepping into this room, brought it to its knees. The chairman cleared his throat softly. "Let the record reflect," he began, but the sound of his voice felt almost intrusive, like a stranger breaking into a prayer. A pen scratched somewhere near the stenographer's desk. A single tick of a wall clock marked the second. The hearing wasn't technically over yet, but the verdict, at least in the court of public opinion, had already been delivered. Jasmine gathered nothing. She didn't reach for the envelope, didn't reclaim the drawing. Everything remained exactly where it was, as though the table itself had become an exhibit for the truth. The cameras lingered one last time on the drawing, the crude but unmistakable shape of a man holding a little girl's hand. And then the broadcast began to fade, not to the chatter of anchors or the slam of a gavel, but to the soft, rhythmic thump of a heartbeat, amplified just enough to be felt more than heard. Over it, faintly came the sound of a pen gliding across paper, the signing of the official hearing record. The screen went black. And in that silence, across America, the image of that drawing burned itself into memory, refusing to let go. In the end, it was not power, wealth, or influence that cut through the noise, but the voice of the innocent and the evidence of love denied. Truth once spoken carries its own light, small at first, but unyielding, until it exposes every shadow. We are measured not by the titles we hold, but by how we protect the most vulnerable among us. And when the choice comes, may we be the ones with the courage to stand, to speak, and to keep the sun shining for them. If this story left a mark on you, don't look away. Sit with it. Let it challenge you. Share it with someone who still believes that truth, no matter how inconvenient, should be heard. Like, comment, and send it to those who think silence keeps them safe. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where every lie meets its reckoning. Hit the bell, because the next story won't be comfortable. It will be unflinching. And it may change the way you see justice, family, and power. This is a fictional dramatization, born from real patterns of injustice and the courage it takes to confront them. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental, or a mirror held up for reflection. Thanks for watching. Truth isn't given, It's fought for. This is Harrison's Stories.